Hello, everyone, and welcome to Insights for Leaders. I'm Anna Purchase, London office senior partner at KPMG, and I'll be your host today as we take a look at what happened at COP28 over the last couple of weeks and what it means for UK organisations. The UN's assessment is that the world is most definitely not on track to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. In fact, it says that with current climate action plans, we're heading towards a 2.5 to 3 degrees of global warming. And that would have huge consequences for people and businesses globally. So, did COP28 make a difference? There were some big developments. Over 100 countries agreed to treble their renewables capacity over the next 7 years. And there was a pledge of hundreds of millions of dollars to a loss and damage fund to provide financial support to developing countries most impacted by climate change. But did those commitments and other developments at COP go far enough? I'm joined by a great lineup of guests to help me answer that question. We'll also be discussing what COP28 means for your climate action plans and how organisations can adapt to the consequences of higher temperatures. So let's meet our guests. Lemay Verre is Head of Strategic Innovation and Sustainability at SSE Energy Customer Solutions. She'll tell us what SSE is doing on sustainability. Louise Hughes, Head of Sustainability and Corporate Responsibility, Europe and Latin America at Ericsson, will share her thoughts on how we can reduce emissions across the supply chain and the role of tech in tackling climate change. And my colleagues from KPMG, Simon Verley CB, Vice Chair and Head of Energy and Natural Resources, will bring us up to speed with the energy transition and outline how we can scale renewables. Bridget Beals, Head of Decarbonisation, Climate and Nature, will provide insights on mitigation and adaptation and what you can do to ensure your business and supply chain are resilient to climate change. And Richard Andrews, Head of UK ESG, will share his views on what came out of COP28 and what business leaders shall be doing right now. We'll leave time at the end so that you can put your questions to our panel during our Q&A session. So please share your questions in the chat box on the right of your screen. And in a moment, we'll be posing some questions to you too, so keep an eye out for that. If you aren't familiar with the SpotMe platform, please check the chat box for our top tips on how to get the best out of this event. It's a packed schedule, a cosy for Christmas, packed studio too, so let's get started. But before we go to our first guest, we'll have a question for you, our audience. On our last event, we looked at what CEOs are prioritising and reflected on the results of our KPMG CEO Outlook survey. The respondents in that survey said that climate change ranked as the second biggest risk to growth over the next 3 years for them. We'd like to know where it sits on your list of priorities. So this is the question. How big a priority are climate change and decarbonisation for your board? Are they the number one priority? Are they on the list? Or truthfully, are they not a focus area right now? We're really looking forward to taking a look at your answers to that later. But in the meantime, Simon, let's start with you. So some big news on renewables from COP28. Could you give us a rundown on the key commitments we heard around the energy transition?
Yeah, sure, I know. And I've got the final agreement where the ink is hardly dry on it in front of me here, signed in the early hours of this morning. 200 countries coming together. That's an achievement in itself. And as you mentioned, one of the big developments was the commitment to treble renewables by 2030, which is going to mean a huge step change in the build out of renewable energy all across the world. We at KPMG have produced a report on what are the barriers to doing that. And we had lots of engagement with clients during COP about those barriers and how you overcome them. But it wasn't the only important thing on the energy transition. There were clear statements about phasing down of unabated coal, so getting coal out of the system, as the UK has done very successfully here. But also, as you mentioned, the Loss and Damage Fund, another important development in terms of helping developing countries cope with the climate change that's already in the system. But the biggest debate over the last 48 hours in particular has been the wording around the future of fossil fuels as a whole. And they've ended up with a phrase about transitioning away from fossil fuels. Now, that's not strong enough for some, including the UK, who are arguing that we needed stronger language, but have agreed to this language, that phrasing. There was quite a lot of pressure to strengthen that to say phase out by an earlier date. But nonetheless, it's the first time that a COP agreement has really made that very clear statement that we're going to be transitioning away from fossil fuels and increasing renewables to substitute, as we aim towards getting towards net zero by 2050. So I think some real substantive progress on the energy transition.
So good, some progress for sure. Is it enough? Is it enough of a breakthrough to ensure we meet our net zero target?
Bluntly, no. We don't yet have the updated assessment. Of course, this is just happening today in terms of what will all these commitments mean in terms of the overall emissions trajectory and what does that mean for global warming. But as you mentioned in your introduction, Anna, the assessment going into COP was that the world was a long way off Paris. And, a number of us have been to many, many COPs. It's the actions and not the words. So it's really what happens now in terms of countries actually following through on those commitments. The UN's assessment was that of the 195 country action plans that they reviewed, not one country was on track to hit its emissions reductions targets. That was going into COP. So we now need to see these, positive words, positive commitments actually turned into action if we're to get anywhere near the Paris Agreement target. So, for businesses out there listening to this, the message is you've got to really think about the resilience of your businesses to different levels of climate change.
Thanks, Simon. And let's hear from a business now. LeMay, if I can bring you in. So SSE clearly has a huge role to play in accelerating the transition to low carbon energy. Could you tell us more about SSE's plans?
So, so from my perspective, because we're on the customer side of the equation, so when you think about the energy trilemma, right? So we've got a generation business that is supporting the country on the security side, but then you've got the affordability, and then of course it has to be sustainable. And the word transition is really key because we also need to transition our business model from being an energy retailer to an energy solutions provider as we roll out low carbon technologies and solutions behind the meter into premises, into households. And then how do you bring that together into an integrated solution to ensure that, the customers are also brought along on that journey? And one of the challenges we've seen, in the last years is that we had the COVID and we had the energy crisis. So uptake hasn't gone up as it should have, but I think looking ahead now, we're going to see some more growth around the uptake in low carbon technologies and solutions, also because of the commitments and the banks also coming in with better green finance as well to allow companies and businesses to take on behind the meter solutions to help their own decarbonization journey.
And how are you helping to balance the need to pick up the pace on decarbonisation with keeping energy affordable for your customers? Many of which are businesses, as you said, we've come through COVID, been many crises. How are you managing that?
So I think from our side, so a lot of the uptake, for example, we've seen in the Irish market has also been driven by government grants and subsidies and, things like that. So what we're hoping is that that kind of translates across GB and Ireland, and we have a bit more support from the grant side of things, but also in terms of the lending and borrowing from the banking side, the private sector, how do we fund these assets and get especially the small, medium-sized enterprises onto this journey? Because, we recognize that we need to help our customers on that journey. So we're also doing a lot of work in the education and awareness pieces. We're going to be running some clinics to get the SMEs to understand why it's important. We did some work earlier on this year, working with business in the community, doing some mentoring for small businesses to help them get started on the climate action plan and what that looks like. And then within that plan, which technologies, which solutions can they start to adopt and kind of drive that. But before all of this, I think one of the lowest hanging fruit is the energy efficiency piece, which is something that we're already doing. So we do a lot of that through our energy services business in Ireland. And we've also got a building energy management systems business here in GB. So that is kind of something that we can all start doing while we wait for the bigger technologies to scale up and adoption rates to increase. So we are focusing on every piece of that puzzle to make sure that we're supporting our customers on their journey to net zero.
It is a puzzle, isn't it?
It is a puzzle.
And there's been a lot of talk about just transition, not just over the last 2 weeks. And I know this is a subject very close to you and your own heart. what have you been doing on that issue? Please tell us some more.
So I think, from an SSE perspective, for example, we were the first company to adopt a just transition strategy, which outlines very clearly 20 principles on how we're going to support our customers, our communities, our employees on the journey. So when we think about our employee cohorts, I think the last count was 1 in 4 has moved from high carbon jobs into low carbon jobs. So we're trying to make sure that that transition is smooth from a people's side of things. But we've also just recently launched, we're funding a 3-year program with Oxford Smith School around how do we take some of the technology and the knowledge as being a renewable deployer here in the UK, how do we take that down to the global south and support other economies as well to leverage, there's no time for everyone to restart the clock. So what can we do in terms of technology transfer, knowledge transfer? So we're really supporting that process as well. So yeah, I think we're on track.
That's amazing. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of that in our questions later. Thank you, Simon and LeMay. We have got the poll result in. If you've got any questions for Simon and LeMay, please do share them in the chat. But our poll results are very interesting. So we asked, how big a priority are climate change and decarbonisation for your board? Number 1 priority, only 12%. On the list, 73%. Not a focus right now, 15%. 15% of our audience today saying it's not a focus area right now. Simon, what do you think to that?
Well, there's a lot going on for business right now. So, I'm not surprised that it's, on the list for the large number of clients, because there are so many other things in terms of the economy, cost of living pressures, etc. I suppose I'd expect that proportion who it is either on the list or a number 1 priority to increase over time, because the blunt truth is global warming is here and it's getting worse. And despite the progress at COP, it will continue to get worse. So I would expect those numbers over time. If we did this survey again, Anna, I'd suggest we might get even more in the on the list or number 1.
Thank you. Bridget, views?
You talked earlier about the Global CEO survey, and I think in that survey, geopolitics was actually the most important issue cited by CEOs, followed by climate change. I think one of the really interesting things about climate change, and possibly one of the frightening things about climate change, is the ability for it to have such an exacerbating impact on geopolitics. So whilst we're leaning into the current geopolitical crisis, we need to think ahead as well to how big those geopolitical crises could get if we leave climate change unchecked.
It's a great point. LeMay, do you want to comment on our survey surprising you?
No, I think, the world's been in a really interesting place the last few years with the COVID, the energy crisis, cost of living crisis. So those numbers are not very surprising, but I think that number is going to get more positive because whether we like it or not, climate change does not have a geographical restriction or a passport. So it will show up where it's going to show up, and businesses need to also think about their own adaptability and resilience across those species. But most importantly, I think Scope 3 is going to drive some of that change as well, because everyone's Scope 1 and 2 is someone else's Scope 3. And so as we all address our Scopes 1 and 2, we will be solving for Scope 3. And so if you want to participate in procurement processes, public procurement, it's just going to organically fix itself, I think. I'm an optimist from that perspective, but I think that was not a really bad result, because I think a lot of companies the last 12 to 15 months have started putting it higher and higher on the agenda. And we're just going to see that number go up.
Louise, you're nodding. What do you think?
I am. Scope 3 has never been more important to us and to our customers at Ericsson as well. And I think seeing the industry collaboration across the tech industry to really have very frank and transparent conversations about Scope 3 and how we're going to tackle understanding more about our chains to reduce our carbon emissions together has never been more important. We actually recently this year kicked off a project with one of our customers in the UK, BT, and that was all about how do we look across our supply chain to lower their embodied carbon emissions. And with one of our manufacturing partners moving to 100% renewable energy, we were able to see that all of the products that Ericsson ships to BT from that facility had a reduced carbon emission of 14 tonnes. And that's small, in the whole chain of both of our groups' emissions. But it shows that those big initiatives we have translated at the product level can really drive that change. And they're just small examples, but it gives us hope that having that transparency across the supply chain can really drive these kind of benefits.
It's a lovely example. Let's stick with you, Louise. Could you tell us a bit more about what you're doing at Ericsson to reduce the carbon footprint across your value chain?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that 12% is really interesting. For us, it's a number one priority. So we really approach net zero with this sort of the rigor and commitment that we do to any other business imperatives. So we have targets, milestones, and then we communicate where we're at with those milestones. So 2030 for us is a key one. And that's where we'll become net zero in our own activities and half the carbon footprint of our portfolio and our supply chain. And then 2040 is the biggie for us, so net zero across our entire value chain. And there's a couple of things that we're doing to do that. So supplier collaboration is key for us. So we've asked 350 of our highest emitting and most strategic suppliers to submit their own 1.5 degree carbon aligned pathway targets. And that was by 2025, but already 225 of them have done so. So really encouraging. And we've provided lots of advice on how to do that. And we're also looking at reducing the carbon emissions of our own portfolio. So we've seen that we can get them down to under 50% of what they are today. And with mobile operators moving to renewable energy, together that's 70% reduction. So just those things are kind of getting us closer to those milestones.
And I know you're not just focused on your own supply chain, you're part of the 1.5 degree zero C supply chain leaders group, where you're collaborating to drive climate change throughout global supply chains. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we saw at COP from the private sector perspective was loads of collaboration. And that's really encouraging, because to do this, to achieve net zero, we need to kind of look beyond our organisational boundaries. And by being part of the supply chain leaders group, we are part of the Exponential Roadmap initiative. And as part of that, and interesting to hear what you were saying, Lame, about supporting SMEs, we've created the first 1.5 degree business playbook. And that's all about providing practical tips and guidance on how to embed sustainability within your organisation and leapfrog any barriers that we might have come into contact with before. So it's actionable advice that people can use in their sort of day-to-day business running.
And how do people join if they're interested?
Just visit the website, 1.5 degrees supply chain leaders. There's loads of UK businesses on there as well that are collaborating, and you can just go online and you can just download all of the information there. So it's really supposed to be tangible, not just theoretical, but
And any particular size business, any sector?
No, really open. You've got global organisations that have contributed as well, so you can see different examples of what's happening. We're a Swedish-based company, so we've got lots of examples from Europe. I also look after Latin America, so we can bring learnings across from there as well. So really interesting place to go to find those resources.
Okay, thank you. Final question for now. So Ericsson, you're at the very heart of technologies like 5G, Internet of Things. What role can these technologies play in helping us hit net zero and be more resilient to climate change?
Yeah, I think massive potential for technology to play a role. So we've done some research at Ericsson that shows that legacy technologies, this is older technology, can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 15%. And that's without even factoring in 5G or artificial intelligence. This year we ran a pilot with an operator in Spain where we looked at if we use artificial intelligence to understand the power consumption of our radio sites, and also when the traffic is coming in to that radio, we could actually activate deep sleep function. And that has reduced energy by 48%, so 48% of energy savings per radio site. So if you just extrapolate those kind of examples as well, you can see the impact that technology is going to have. And I think with decarbonising industries as well, there's loads of different technologies that we can use to help that low carbon economy come to life. So it's really starting to test them. And those technologies are here now. That's not a future thing.
Amazing, thank you. I'd love to hear a bit more about that in the Q&A if we have time. Thank you. But now we're going to turn to our KPMG team. Bridget, coming to you first. So it's looking very unlikely that we'll keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. I think you agree. Yeah. And even if we do, just checking, even if we do, we're still looking at climate change impacting how we live and work. So let's talk about that a bit. How are we getting ready for the impact of a hotter world on the places we live and work? And what was said, let's start, what was said at COP about adaptation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing to say right off the cusp is, even if we're in a 1.5 degrees world, and I think everybody in the room desperately hopes that we can still get there, albeit the possibility is diminishing, that is still a least worst outcome from a climate perspective. 1.5 degrees is still a lot worse than where we are today, and every 0.1 of a degree from there has massive ramifications for the way we live, the way we work, the things we consume, and it does mean that we're going to have a radical shift. So let's take something like rice, for example. 3.5 billion people in the world eat rice every day. In China alone, rice production is down 8% in the last 20 years. That's from heavy rainfall. But what we're starting to see, which is really quite frightening, is increasing salination in the rice paddies, because they are, of course, by definition, low-lying. And as sea levels rise, that salination is dramatically reducing rice crops around the world. So that's just one commodity, and I think we can all probably extrapolate from there, what happens as those 3.5 billion people don't have access to that. But from an adaptation perspective, we need to make sure that the businesses who are producing critical commodities or goods or services are thinking about those changes in their ability to deliver those goods to market, that they're adapting their business models to accommodate for that changing need, but that they're not just leaving those historic supply chains and producers to sort of produce in other places, that they're helping those producers to find new livelihoods, new crops that they can grow that are maybe more resilient. That's all part of what the world is aiming for from an adaptation perspective. Now, some of the outcomes at COP were probably not as bold as we would have liked from an adaptation perspective. We were hoping to agree some adaptation targets. So how would the Global North support the Global South in that adaptation pursuit? We were hoping for a $300 million adaptation fund. We fell a little bit short of that target, but it's the first time that adaptation has really been on the COP agenda in a big way. And so it's a really important development and one we can't lose sight of. It's very rare in COP terms for the first year that something's on the agenda for it to have a major breakthrough. So it's the start of a really important conversation and really important for businesses to start to think about that long-term framing, both from a business perspective, but also from that kind of double impact perspective, and how do their supply chains, the local communities in which they do business, fare under some of those climate outcomes as well.
So let's go a little bit deeper into that. So for the businesses with us today, what do you think they need to be doing and thinking about now in terms of mitigation and adaptation and ensuring their organisations are resilient to climate change?
Yeah, so there's really kind of three key things: 2 mitigation and 1 big adaptation as well. So in the mitigation side, I break this into 2 groups. One is decarbonisation. We may have a reducing ability to hit 1.5 degrees, but we absolutely must keep trying and pushing as hard as we can towards that outcome. So companies, in spite of some of these geopolitical challenges, these cost of living crises that sort of surround us, we have to continue to try to find ways to create the business case for change. And as renewable costs come down, we are seeing real, tangible opportunities for businesses to drive value through sustainable business models in pursuit of those net zero outcomes. So that's part one. Part two of mitigation is making sure that they're really clear of what are the risks to their business model as climate change impacts us, and whether that's a 1.5 or a 4 degrees world. And we separate that into a couple of different buckets. One is around the risk of sort of direct damage. Are there huge warehouses or key production sites where damage to the site might cause an impact? Maybe that's because the roof comes off the building, or maybe that's because actually it's just too hot to operate the site during the summer going forward. And actually maybe the impact is lost revenue because you can't operate over an extended period of time. There's also the supply chain element of that. So what happens if you can't get critical input goods, can't get your goods to market in the same way that you did in the past? And we've started to see that coming through a little bit. The Suez is obviously an incredibly important trade route, but in the last several months, we've seen some of the water levels through that shipping route are actually been dangerously low, and we've had to start taking alternative routes, which are extending time to market and fundamentally going to value. So companies need to identify where those potential impacts in their businesses are, integrate those with their broader enterprise risk management framework to understand what's a watching brief and where might this potentially breach a risk threshold, where they want to take mitigating actions today. So whether that's building a flood wall, whether that's diversifying their supply chains, all sorts of things that they can do now to mitigate the financial impacts of climate change impacting on their business. And then the final thing is that adaptation lens as well. So looking ahead, we know there is going to be a massive economic transformation. Whether we're in a world where we're rapidly adapting or a world where we're rapidly decarbonising, or hopefully a combination of the two, the world will look and feel fundamentally different. And companies need to be thinking about how their business model and their business interacts and interfaces with that as they go forward, and how do they pivot their products into this new economy to make sure that they remain thriving and resilient come what may as we go forward.
That's really clear, and I'm sure we'll get some additional points to build on what you've said. Thank you, Bridget. I'm going to move us on. Really interested to know, what role do you think the voluntary carbon markets have to play in achieving the mitigation and adaptation outcomes?
I think the voluntary carbon market is a really incredibly important part of giving us the opportunity to deliver both a low carbon world but also a just transition. Now, I'm very clear that we need to make sure that that happens in a high integrity, high trust way, but the carbon market has a proven track record. Lots of people think that we're trying to build a carbon market for the first time, but we had the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, which was launched in the 1990s, and that very successfully drove huge volumes of capital from the north to the south. It got renewables into China and India for the first time, and yes, it wasn't perfect, and there's a lot of lessons we can learn from that, but the model works. And it works in a way that moves beyond these sort of loss and damage and adaptation funds, which are very much kind of development aid based, into creating a model where the private sector has a commercial opportunity to really direct capital at scale into emerging markets. And for me, that is absolutely fundamental. And there's a huge amount of work going on across the marketplace to bring that governance so that we can have that trust and allow that capital to really start to flow and unlock as we go forward.
And there were some developments at COP in this space, I think.
There were, not as many as we would have liked. Article 6 has been under negotiations for the last, since COP26 in fact. We've seen a lot of developments over the last 24 months in some of the wording around Article 6, but we don't quite have agreement on what that's going to look like from a globally governed carbon market yet. We do, of course, have a voluntary carbon market that's operating outside of that Paris Agreement framework today. And one really important development that did occur was that some of those standard setters for the voluntary carbon market, so the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, et cetera, actually came together, and they said, there's just another alphabet soup happening here. We're going to set a single framework for what this is going to look like. And I can't overstate how important that is as a step forward to give confidence to the market around a single framework that allows them to actually participate in that market as they go forward.
Lots of nods of agreement on the sofa. Alphabet soup, I'm sure when we come to you, Rich, in a moment, you'll be talking about that. But for our audience, that is good news, isn't it? You're not having to look at quite so many standard setters, perhaps some coming together. Excellent. Thank you, Bridget. We're going to take another poll question. So the question for our audience, please. What was the most significant development at COP28 from your point of view? Was it the commitment to treble renewables? Was it the loss and damage fund commitments? Is it the collaboration of carbon market standard setters that we've just been talking about? Or was it the prevalence of nature? Really interested in your views, and we'll take a look at your responses later, right after we've heard from our final guest, Richard, our head of ESG in the UK. What was your biggest takeaway from what you've heard today, and what are the implications for business leaders?
Thank you, Anna. I'd probably take a little bit of a step back, and obviously there's been a huge focus at COP on carbon reduction, carbon removals, adaptation. But I think the biggest number that hits me, and actually we've talked about a little bit already today, is that 2.5% to 3% estimate coming from the UN. And that's a really scary number in terms of what it means the world will be like in 10, 15, 20 years' time. But even as I stand back from that, actually thinking, where are we now? So 2023, I think on course to be the hottest year in records. We're looking down the barrel of 1.5 degrees, and we're already seeing that impact. And Bridget talked about a number of the areas we're seeing the impact in terms of the way that we live, where we can live. So for me, one of the biggest things coming out of COP is to reflect that for business, climate change is a real and present danger now. And 85% of people said that climate was on their top table. I'd have hoped it would be slightly higher. But as you start to think that through, and Bridget touched on a number of areas of supply chain. So what is robustness, resilience of supply chain? What geographies are people in? Are they sustainable? Are they insurable? Because if you can't get insurance, you can't do business. What are the impacts of migration? So for me, the big thing is almost that stand back and say, there are a number of these impacts that are happening right now, and boards need to be engaging with them.
And what does this mean for companies' ESG commitments?
So commitments are really important, and events like COP put the scrutiny in particular areas. And it's important that companies are playing their part and making commitments. And we've heard about some of the great commitments from SSE and Ericsson today already. And they are important, and people are looking at them. Investors are scrutinising them. Customers, employees are looking at them. I've met with a number of regulators in recent months who are actually starting to get a more forensic inspection of the commitments that people are making. And I think one of the important things around commitments is how deliverable they are. So is there that robust plan that stands behind the commitment? Are people really confident in the commitments that they're making? And you touched on the alphabet soup or alphabet wave of regulation coming. But we have that particularly on disclosure and reporting. So Louise and I were talking just before we started about CSRD in Europe, and there's a huge amount of disclosure that's going to happen through that. It's also driving a lot of change, which is really positive. But with CSRD and the UK disclosures and new international standards coming through, there's going to be a huge amount more transparency on how companies are actually doing against the commitments they've made and the progress that they're making. And that has a knock-on implication for management in terms of how they're looking at those disclosures, at the key KPIs and criteria, and how robust are those numbers? Are they assurable? Have you got the right process and controls around those? So lots going on in that space. I think commitment's really, really important. And boards need to be confident that they will be able to meet those commitments, because there will be consequences in the market from customers, from regulators if they are ultimately falling short.
And what does good look like? What are the questions that business leaders should be asking to make sure they are on track?
Yeah, I think there are a few different things to be thinking through, but I think it starts with what are those commitments and being really clear on what commitments are you making, and then thinking through what is your plan to deliver those. So we have transition plans that people are starting to disclose. Disclosures typically are at a higher level, but it's what lies behind those in terms of that really robust, detailed transition plan to help you get from where you are to where you want to be. And that involves things like looking at what technology is available or is needed, what is the funding, where are things in capital plans, what level of governance have you got in place, and how are you going to link that through to incentives?
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. We've got the results of our poll question in, so let's take a look at the results of our second poll. We asked what was the most significant development at COP28. It's been changing just in the last few seconds. Thanks for those answers. But still, at number one, 59% of people saying it's the commitment to treble renewables. So Simon, interested in your reaction to that. 18% loss and damage fund commitments, 12% collaboration of carbon market standard setters, and 11% the prevalence of nature. Simon, what do you think?
Well, I'm not surprised by that, because I think the commitment to trebling renewables was one of the headline grabbing announcements, and is so critical, because we're going to have to electrify everything. We're going to have to electrify transport, we're going to have to electrify heating, we're going to have to electrify parts of industry, and we need loads of renewables to do that. So not that surprised. I would encourage everybody to have a look at our report on how you do it, because we've just done a big report about that and about the barriers that need to be overcome, because it's not just getting the wind farms built, the solar built, you've got to get those transmission lines built as well to connect the power to where it's actually needed.
Thank you.
Coming back to that point, because you've got to manage the demand side, so the tripling up of renewables will secure and provide supply, but alongside is still 8 billion people around the globe that we've got to carry on and make sure that we're also managing the demand side. So I was quite pleased with the 2 times energy efficiency as well.
Excellent. Louise, your thoughts on our poll?
Yeah, not surprised. I think energy efficiency is the number one focus for us as well. As we continue to develop the next generation of our products and networks, they become more inherently energy efficient, which is really important, and even down to lighter radio equipment and modernising infrastructure. So it's definitely the right way forward.
Nature coming in low, Bridget, were you surprised?
I mean, I'm not surprised, because there was no sort of big bang for nature at COP, but what was really important was that there was a really building consensus that nature belongs at the climate COP. For those of you who don't know, last year in Montreal, there was COP15, which was the Nature and Biodiversity COP, and it had its own thing. It was also at COP28 in a very big way, and that is so important, because the climate-nature nexus is absolutely, again, at the heart of how we're going to tackle this net zero challenge. So about a third of the carbon we can sequester will come through nature, and that's not just afforestation. It's a combination of afforestation, avoided deforestation, things like peatland restoration, huge projects that need to be undertaken to protect and restore nature, but in doing so, also tackle some of this big carbon challenge that we've got. The nice byproduct of all of that is in restoring and protecting that nature, and we will also protect and restore biodiversity. And for a lot of people, that will sound like just a nice to have, but again, the links between biodiversity and all those commodities, the adaptation, the way we live, is absolutely paramount. And we need to protect and restore that nature to continue to protect the viability of our financial system. So I can't, again, sort of convey with enough strength how important it is that nature is there. And again, we can look forward to much more in the way of real tangible headline commitments in future COPs, be those nature and biodiversity COPs or indeed COP29 for climate and nature.
Great. So important that nature was there. Look to COP29 for more confirmation on what happens next and agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, it's also worth saying that, of course, at COP15 last year, we had the Montreal Accord, which was the sort of setting of biodiversity targets at a global level. Next year, we'll have COP16 for nature and biodiversity. So nature will again have its moment as we start to look at that on both an independent and an integrated basis. And I think that's really important too.
Thank you. Richard, any comments from you on the poll before we move to Q&A?
I was just going to build, and maybe outside of COPs, but I think one of the things encouraging that I've seen over the last 6-9 months has been an increasing focus by business on nature. So actually this is coming into the boardroom, and people are recognising both that interdependence of climate and nature, but also seeing natural solutions as part of the solution and part of the answer to some of the challenges around climate.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for all your views. Coming back at you, because we have got a lot of questions in today. So thank you for everybody who submitted a question. Going to start, Lame, with you on the just transition. A just transition means we need to focus on supporting developing countries too. What are the panelists' views on how we can best do that? Let's start with you.
So I think, first of all, we recognize that this is a global challenge. So it doesn't really make sense to solve climate change in one part of the world and leave the rest of the world behind. But then the key word there is the transition. So you also have to go back and check what are they transitioning from and to what. And also recognizing that for it to be just, fair and orderly, that transition could look differently in different parts of the world. And so that mapping, I think, is something that needs to then happen to understand if country A is not able to get to destination D, is C good enough? But what does that mean for 1.5, right? So it's really going back to those 195 countries and mapping out what transition looks like for each one and what is the impact as well if we don't hit those targets. But it's got to be just, fair and orderly. I think we can't just pull a system and then have nothing else in place. So it's about building in parallel what is currently there and then trying to accelerate, because of course we're a month into the end of the year, and so we need to from 2024 to 2030 is not a long time to accelerate, and think that having that just transition piece even at the COP was quite significant as well, because I think the world recognizes you can't solve it halfway and then leave the other half. So it's got to be a global approach from that perspective.
Yeah, Bridget, you're nodding.
One of the things I love about COP is that it's really easy when you're sort of sitting here in your ivory tower in Europe to think about this as a sort of developed world challenge, to take things for granted, to think about this as a sort of purely sort of financial and business decision. And you get on the ground at COP and there's this, I say wonderful, but it's also wonderfully sad at the same time, kind of element to COP where you have this kind of very nationalist kind of approach of, countries have country stands, there's people in national dress, they're singing their national songs and conveying what is going to be lost as a result of climate change if we don't act in that sort of uniform way to protect this sort of global climate. And we know that some of the most vulnerable nations in the world to climate change are also some of the most underdeveloped. We have climate refugees today. A lot of the Pacific Islands are under significant threat. For me as I say original New Zealander, my mother would probably kill me for saying that. I'm still a New Zealander. For me as a New Zealander, that's an incredibly important part of my identity. The Pacific Islands are my neighbours, and seeing those islands potentially being eroded quite quickly, within the next decade or two, is very, very significant. And there's a real loss of cultural identity through that. How we embrace that need to to both protect those vulnerable nations, but also adapt those vulnerable nations through the Loss and Damage Fund, through the Adaptation Fund, and through the actions that we as businesses all take to consider our supply chains and our interactions into those communities around the world, is an incredibly important part of that double impact thinking that we need to be bringing into the sustainability debate.
Thank you. A very direct question next, and come to you, Simon. Does the whole COP process need to change?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, actually, I'm struck by, you and I were both at the dinner with Sir Alok Sharma out in Dubai, who chaired COP26, and he was asked a very similar question at this event. And his answer was, well, if you could think of a better process, then let me know. But it's got its flaws, but at the end of the day, this is a global problem, as you were saying. So the whole world does have to come together, and we have to discuss this together to find a just transition. So he was mounting a robust defence of the fact that despite all its flaws and the late nights of negotiating, as we saw last night, he couldn't think, having chaired it, of a better way to get the world to come together. It is the most extraordinary sight, isn't it? You literally have every country in the world represented at COP, and this time it was over 100,000 people. I mean, it seems to have grown and grown in terms of size. So I think my answer would be, if anybody could think of a better mechanism, that would be great. But it's hard to think of how you do it other than bringing 200 countries together in one place to discuss what more we need to do to tackle it.
Lama, you are nodding and agreeing. Same view?
No, it's like, half bread is better than none sometimes. And so I'm an optimist. So for me, I think the COP process, can be better, can be smaller, and there are loads of could if, should if, but there is nothing else on the table. And we don't have time to recreate, we've done this now 28 times. So if you're going to start a new process, then there's a learning curve. So we may as well just continue to ride this wave. But I think the most important piece is that having those clear ambitions is great, but you need to have a plan. You need to align your stakeholders. You need to align the funding, and then we just need to get moving, right? Those are my 5 steps. And if we have that, I think, the rest of it is just kind of noise, but we will make significant progress.
Lots of nods. Thank you very much. Thank you. Right, another very direct question for Richard. How does net zero fit into the wider context of ESG? Could you take us through that, Richard?
Now, I think net zero is a large component of ESG, so environment, social and governance. Under environment, a lot of our focus is climate, and we've talked about nature increasingly coming up, and obviously net zero is right at the heart of what's going on around climate. I think one of the reasons we look at the 3 together, so E, S and G, is actually the just transition discussion actually is an important part of that. It's the intersectionality of those 3 areas, so environment into social. So if you're looking at trying to achieve net zero through scaling renewables, but you need rare minerals to build some of those renewables, what are the social implications of the operations to access those rare minerals? So I think it fits very much at the heart of ESG, but importantly, we bring them together because there are dependencies between the 3.
Any other views on that?
No, I think from my perspective, the whole energy transition, decarbonization is about people and livelihoods. So if we're doing it for humanity, then they should be at the heart of everything we do. So it's just imperative that we keep a focus on the human side of things as well.
Well, it should be less about disaster avoidance and more about better lives, really, shouldn't it? And about that lasting impact on future generations. So the more that we can do, now, the more important it is. And I totally agree with what you're saying about the 5 steps, all those things needed for the chain reaction to happen.
I totally agree with what you were saying earlier about the just transition and the need for think about this in a global sense, but considering it in a more local sense as well. I heard a lovely story out at COP28 about a company setting up a cable factory in Scotland to build the transmission lines to connect the renewables offshore. to where the power's needed, and they're retraining oil and gas workers to work in the cable factory in Inverness. And there is in my opinion, a sort of local example of what just transition could look like. And I thought it was a good local perspective on what that means.
Yeah, it certainly is. Thank you. We have got so many questions today, so I'm going to keep us rattling through. An interesting one. Do the panel think the world has actually become incorrectly focused on keeping 1.5 alive, even though a temperature change of 1.5 degrees will have catastrophic impact on millions? Bridget, can I come to you first on that? I know you'll have views.
I was desperately hoping you weren't going to direct that one at me. Look, I think one of the really interesting things about the IPCC sort of process is they almost fall to the lowest common denominator amongst the scientists. So there are thousands of scientists opining on where we are right now. The reality is, when we talk about being at 1.1 to 1.3, with the growth assumptions that are baked into our global economy, we may well already be at 1.5 because we've kind of gone to, we've erred on the side of caution in making the determinations about where we are and what kind of emissions in the global economy might be. What that then means is 1.5 is a sort of aspirational but pragmatic target point for us to be aiming towards as we seek to both enable the developing world to continue to grow and urbanize and all those sorts of things, and decarbonise at the same time. Actually, before COP, somebody asked me whether we should just throw 1.5 out the door and accept that really 2 is the target now. And I was very clear that I don't think that is a possibility, because if you start saying 2 is the target, we really start aiming towards 2.5, and it's that toddler test, isn't it? You're always very strict with your toddlers because you have to be, and I think it's the same logic here. We need to keep ruthlessly focused on an aspirational target. At the moment, that's 1.5. If we start to look like we're on track for that, I'll be the first to say we should uprate that to 1 and actually start to reduce global temperatures. But I think it's fair to say we're a long way off that right now.
Thank you. I knew you'd have strong views on that one. Right, jumping now. How do we overcome the current obstacles to onshore wind? And do we think government policy will move in favour of it? Which government, I guess? Simon, let's come to you on that one.
So we started this conversation by talking about trebling renewables. We're going to need all the renewable electricity we can get, which means we've got to maximise onshore wind and solar and offshore wind and every other form of renewables we can get our hands on. So we need to crack this one. Will the current government change its position? It would argue it's already changed planning policy guidance. I would argue not far enough. So there needs to be changes to the way that planning policy works, such that not just one objector can hold up an onshore wind farm, which has been the case over the last 5 or 6 years. The second thing is community benefits. So there are now innovative schemes about the bill reduction you get if you live near an onshore wind farm, or indeed community ownership, which actually means that people are actually vested in their local energy generating capacity and actually taking that power off the grid for the local community. So it becomes much more part of the community. So there are ways forward, lots of innovation here going on. But I think my main message is we really do need to maximise on onshore wind, because we're going to need every renewable electron we can get our hands on.
Thank you. And just staying on this, well, related, what role does the panel believe that hydrogen has to play in the UK when compared with electrification? Come to you first.
Hydrogen's got a very big role. Alongside renewable electricity, hydrogen will play a big role in terms of storage, of long duration storage, as we call it, for when there's big anticyclone in the winter. It'll play a big role in industry, in heavy transport, in power generation. I know SSE have got plans for hydrogen powered generation, potentially, though we still await the trials, in some parts on heating, alongside the deployment of heat pumps the government, we should hear tomorrow, I believe, about the plans on hydrogen from the government. So we'll look out for that.
Thank you. Anybody else like to comment on that?
No, I think hydrogen, we need all technologies, right? So it's and not either or. And for the things that we're not going to be able to electrify, you're going to need some level of molecules, and what color is that molecule is the question, right? So how far out are we on hydrogen? How long is a piece of string? So we don't know, but I think it should be part of the equation. So we need all the technologies. It's not one is better than the other. They will solve different things, because when we think about electrification, it will do transportation really well. It will do domestic really well, SMEs really well. But what are you going to do with petrochemicals, steel and cement? The hard to abate sectors need heavy thermal energy, and energy transition itself is energy intensive. So we have to really kind of look at it end to end. So it's not just taking one piece of the puzzle, coming back to my puzzle. It's looking at the entire picture and thinking, okay, this will be good for this part of the puzzle. That is great for that part of the puzzle, and working that out end to end. So that would be my view when it comes to all technologies, not just picking on one, because, yeah.
Thank you. And a question for all our panel, I think, what would you like to have seen from COP28 that you didn't see? Richard, maybe if we come to you first.
I think we'd have all liked to see even higher ambition in terms of the piece of paper in front of Simon and the communique at the end. So I'd have liked to see things pushed further and faster.
Probably for me, it's on that carbon market side. I've grown up alongside the carbon market over 20 years. I fundamentally believe in its ability to drive change, and it's disappointing we haven't had swifter action on that.
Thank you. Louise?
100% agree with Richard. I think that stronger language would have been, preferable. However, still an achievement. Some of the economies that are moving towards, or have signed this type of fossil fuels, underpin their economies. So it's good to see movement forward on that.
Thank you. Lome?
So as a very positive and optimistic person, I would take the climate finance. I think that was a win. I would take, the renewables tripling, the energy efficiency. Even the conversation across sectors as well was really positive. I think it's the first time that all players were in the room, and how can we collaborate and have that intersectionality of sectors as well? Because at the end of the day, there is a crossover between how we all decarbonize. But I think if you say, well, okay, what did not happen there, it's really hard to tell, because actually maybe we wouldn't have had this at all, right? So we still got something at the end of the day, but it's what happens now, the actions between COP28 and 29, and then going on to COP30 will be the big, that's what we need to really focus on. So I wouldn't worry about the rearview mirror now. I want us to kind of keep pushing ahead.
Okay, thank you. And Simon, what would you like to have seen?
Well, you stole the words. I think it's all about the actions, isn't it? Yeah. It's not about the words. We've got the commitments on the paper. It's all about what happens now, and do countries and companies do what we've said we're going to do. That's what we need to see.
Great. Well, thank you. We've covered a huge amount of ground. So thanks to all of you for your questions. If I were to summarise, COP may not be perfect, but it's the best we've got, and we saw some significant steps in the right direction. It's looking pretty certain, this panel agreed, that we're going to miss the 1.5 degree target. Whilst it's vital we keep global warming as low as possible, organisations also need to be thinking about adaptation. And perhaps most importantly, this isn't something you can ignore. It will impact your business, so make sure you're asking the right questions. Well, that's it from us for today. Please visit the resources tab for all our latest insights and events. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back in the new year. And until then, I hope you all enjoy the festive period and return rejuvenated for what's sure to be another challenging but hopefully rewarding year. Thank you.